Well, the former Irish President Mary Robinson has just returned from that visit to Somalia in her capacity as honorary president of the aid organisation Oxfam International. She joined me a short time ago from Dublin. Mary Robinson, many thanks for joining Late Line this evening.
I'm happy to.
You've just returned from Somalia, indeed just yesterday. It's a visit that in many ways has a sort of awful symmetry, doesn't it? Because it was 20 years ago that you were there, and it was 20 years ago that famine was last used to describe what's happening in Somalia.
Yes, in fact, 19 years to be precise. It was in October 1992, and there had been a whole summer of both drought, famine and conflict at the time between warlords. So the food couldn't get to people, and Irish aid agencies asked me if I would go as president. And I was happy to draw attention and went to the United Nations and spoke about the scale of the problem. Again, this time, Irish aid agencies who are involved on the ground there asked me if I would travel with them and try and highlight the problem. And it was really very heart-wrenching to be in Dullo in Somalia. They actually had photographs on the health centre of my visit 19 years ago, and to see very much the same images, but the numbers seem to be really devastating, who are having to leave Somalia, partly because it's very difficult to get access there for food within the country.
And of course, it's a whole new generation of people who are suffering.
It is, and children in particular, children who are severely malnourished. I watch them being weighed and given the plumpy nuts. And then the nurse told me, but unfortunately, these should stabilise the children. They should begin to gain weight. But in a number of cases, the plumpy nuts, which should be for the malnourished child, are shared with other children or even with mothers who are desperate because they haven't got enough food. And some of them have travelled more than 100 kilometres. They were in transit within Somalia into Ethiopia on the day that I was there 3 days ago. And those in transition had sort of come and were collapsed under trees, being given a minimum amount of water and food to tide them over while they went into Ethiopia. And then the following day, the day before yesterday, I was in the big Dadaab camp, which is really 3 huge camps, each of which has more than 100,000 Somali refugees. They are registered, they do get food when they arrive, but there's such a pressure that some of them are not in the proper camp, and they run out of their rations, and the camp itself is enormous. We drove for miles and miles to get from one place to another, and yet these people have to do it on foot. It's a very sad, very chronic situation, and I think it's worse this year than in 1992.
Worse because of the numbers, or worse because I've read you or heard you describe it as a perfect storm? It's way more than just drought.
It is a perfect storm. There has been a conflict in Somalia basically since I was there in 1992. It has not had good governance of any kind to address internally. The drought is worse. There's a La Nina effect, and there's also an increasing sense of this being the warmest 8 years in the Horn of Africa ever. We know that there is this global warming. It's affecting that part of Africa very dramatically. High food prices have made buying food a very difficult option. And on the first day I was there, we went to a part of northern Kenya, which is very dry, the Chalbi Desert it's called, and we stayed overnight in a small town, and we met a number of pastoralists affected, and they move to get water, and they have to go further and further, and you can almost see them becoming the next refugees if we're not careful, and yet they have a perfectly viable life normally, you know, and indeed make a big contribution as pastoralists because they provide meat to the market. And we were talking about how to make them more resilient because, frankly, I was haunted by the reality that we're facing the beginnings of these climate negative impacts. It makes the problems worse because there are no predictable seasons, because there are long periods of drought and then flash flooding. But most of all, seeing those starving and undernourished children and knowing that this is July. When I was there in 1992, I went in October, just before they would expect a rainy season. Now it's going to be dry with no rain at least until October, if the rains come in October, which nobody's sure of.
And yet, despite that picture that you paint, the international community has been, as many are now saying, very reluctant to help. Why do you think that is? Do you think it's fundamentally because of a concern that the aid simply won't get through, or is there something deeper at work?
I think that's part of it. While we were there, two big areas of Somalia were declared to be famine areas, which means that people are starving to death, particularly children and the elderly already. And that has helped to galvanise, I think. Certainly the head of the World Food Programme was in Mogadishu yesterday, and she's announcing that they're going to use different methods to get food to people. There's to be a big FAO meeting in Rome next Monday, and indeed the Security Council was discussing climate change and security. And Secretary General Ban Ki-moon was talking about these climatic disturbances and unpredictable consequences already. So that's helping. But the reality is the humanitarian coordinator, Mark Bowden, was telling us in Nairobi, we met him there, that there hasn't been a good response. There's a sense somehow of using the word terrorism in relation to Somalia that is turning people off. But this isn't about Al-Shabaab or anybody else. This is about millions of people who must have access to basic food to stay alive, basic water. And I have been aware, of the fact that two of the organisations I was with, Trócaire and Concern of Ireland, have been in Somalia for 20 years and find ways to work within a difficult system. So it's not, I think we have to do more to address the problems, and hopefully this terrible crisis again, this famine, the deaths, the struggle of people to go, hundreds of kilometres, to be sometimes robbed or raped en route, as we heard from some of the women, that this will maybe change the balance, because undoubtedly aid agencies have been told they can have access to areas they weren't able to have access to before. And it could be that this could be the crisis that opens up Somalia to the need to come together more inclusively with some form of government that will produce peace and stability for a period that will allow the country to stabilise.
Because I wonder that if not, is food aid really just a band-aid? I mean, if you've got a completely failed state, you've had no central government there for 2 decades, is it enough for the West to simply put money and food in? Is it almost time for something else to happen?
It's vital in the short term. The UN has said it needs at least another 250 million now urgently, and probably $1 billion over a period to ensure that they can address the multiple problems of the refugees who have already had to leave Somalia and the problem in Somalia itself. That is urgent. We cannot let children die. This is the 21st century. It's already in a way a disgrace for all of us, not just the Somali government or non-government, that a famine has been fully developed, because the warning signs were there. Only 40% response has been met so far in the appeal for the Horn of Africa. And it's not just Somalia, it's also Ethiopia, Kenya itself, as I saw, and Djibouti. There are more than 10 million people at risk. Tens of thousands of children will die in the coming months unless we get the food aid. But then you're perfectly right. We need climate resilient ways of ensuring livelihoods. And I did hear very good advice when I was in northern Kenya with the pastoralists from one of the workers of Concern Worldwide, the aid agency there. He's a Maasai, and he's also a qualified veterinary surgeon. And he was a wonderful, knowledgeable advocate for the pastoralists. They represent about 20% of the population of Kenya, and that's a population of about 40 million. So you're talking about 8 million with a lot of arid land that they can have an existence on by moving their goats and camels around, but they need to diversify as well, and that's what he's helping them to do, to diversify into honey, into chickens, into alternative ways of income generation, also having more resilient types of sheep. He was talking about the red Maasai sheep, which are better sheep, and smaller camels, which are less vulnerable. And these are very important indicators of the future, because we know that the climate impacts are going to get worse. I was haunted by having a sense I was seeing a window into a future that's almost on us in a global sense, in so many places. But this is a very vulnerable part in the Horn of Africa.
Mary Robinson, you paint a truly disturbing picture, really. But thank you very much for joining us and telling us about it this evening.
It's a pleasure, and I just hope there will be an urgent response from Australia as well, because it is so badly needed. Thank you.
Thank you.